Hi, my name's Faull. I'm an actor, writer, director and weekly class facilitator of Actors Tribe. I thought I'd share a little bit of a taster with you today of what we do in class, just to make things a little bit easier. What I've noticed is whether you're a beginner or advanced is that acting can be one of those things that you make really, really complicated when you kind of don't have to. A lot of your experienced actors will spend a lot of time focusing on what does my character do? Do they get out of the bed every morning on the left side or the right side? How many bowel movements do they have a day? What do they have for breakfast? How many molecules of toxins do they have in their body? Things that ultimately we don't really see on the screen. So it's kind of nice just to have a basic framework to apply each scene with. And I like to put this framework on one hand. That way, rather than referring to a pile of notes that you've scribbled all over the script or in a notebook or in your phone, you can just go through these off the top of your head on one hand. So these are called the 5 W's. I won't go through all of them right now. We're just going to focus on one. So each of these are attached, each of the W's to one finger. We have where are you, who are you talking to, what are you doing, who am I, and what do I want, and why. So that's all of them. Today we're going to go focus on one, which is who are you talking to. This is a great one to start with because it is a way of diluting self-consciousness. A lot of the times we think about just our lines and just what I'm saying and just what I'm doing, but that can change when you start to think about who am I talking to. So in every scene we're talking to someone opposite the camera that we have a relationship with. And so it's really important to explore that relationship within each conversation, within each scene that we're having. So drawing from the book of our own life experience, in this scene, who are we talking to? Is it my mother? Is it my brother? Is it my dad? Is it a boss? Is it someone I'm the boss of? Is it someone that I'm in love with and flirtatious with? So when you consider that, you start to change that energy immediately. So whether it's standing here as we normally do within the frame, this is the way that we're always trained to obediently stand within a frame and turn our body to face the reader and turn our eyes forward. And after a while, this starts to feel very, very natural and very dull. But if we take into consideration, who am I talking to? And we start to explore this relationship, there's a lot of things that now change this scene and make it a little more dynamic within this frame. Is it someone that I have a little bit of disdain for, so I don't really give a lot of facing forward body language to? Is it someone that I don't really want to look in the eyes either? Is it someone that I'm kind of flirtatious with and I quite like them and I want to be a little bit closer proximity wise and maybe I want to warm up my eyeline to them a little more? It's just a way to change things around and start to explore the relationship dynamic that is happening on the page. It makes for a far more interesting scene to watch rather than just focusing on turning your body this way and delivering your lines. So that's just one thing to consider. Again, this is just no hard and fast rule. It's not a dogmatic approach. The 5 W's and who are you talking to are just one thing you can start to play with within your scene work. So I look forward to sharing some more tips with you and perhaps the rest of the W's in a couple more videos. Have fun talking to who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? Talking to me? Okay, so we've explored a little bit about what the W of who are you talking to is. Now let's talk a little bit more about how you can actually apply this when you're working on a script. So you'll see that in the documents section I've attached a script here which is referred to Can't Paint, which has Frankie and Lewis. There's 2 points of reference that I think actors need to always draw their inspiration from, so that we don't get too highfalutin and kind of take off into these random tangents and overanalyze things. So those 2 things are the script. All the answers you ever need are in the script. So we don't have to make too many outside of the box kind of analysis here. We can just really work with what's on the page. And the thing I'm really trying to break down is that actors usually just pick the character that they're going to read for and then they just focus on the lines that that one character is saying. What I'm actually trying to get you guys to do overall, to employ the W of who are you talking to, is to look at this scene as a conversation as a whole. So you're looking at what both characters are saying to each other and the journey of the scene as a whole. So what we do is we third person things and then we first person things, okay? The second point of reference to draw from is the school of life, as I mentioned in the last one, or the book of your life. So when we're reading through this, anytime you kind of get a sense of the relationship that's going on here, do your best to try and endow this person or your reader or the eyeline that you're choosing off camera as someone that is very similar to a relationship that feels like this one. So I'll explain as I go through with the script. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to go through some key points, some key moments that happen in the scene to just help punch up those aspects of who are you talking to, and also why it's important to look at this conversation as a whole. So we read this almost as a transcription of a conversation, right? So if this was just something that, if this was a police transcript of two people having a conversation, you can just read it in that way. So you get a good sense of what's happening over the journey of events, not just focusing in on your lines. And then our job is to, as actors, take it into a first person experience. And that's when we can start to draw from the book of life and apply our own emotional experiences to this relationship dynamic. So I'll start to step through this. So we're in Frankie and Lewis's kitchen, day. So always read the scene heading to get a sense of where we are. And then Frankie and Lewis are in their kitchen, drunk, listening to Lewis's new album. So immediately we know what both of these characters are doing, and we know the setting that they're in. And it is obviously both of their kitchens, so this is a couple that's living together. So let's say that I'm reading for Lewis first of all. So it's important to get into their point of view as much as possible, but also listen to what the other character is saying so that they know, so that we know how this character is being affected, how that affects me, and then we have the tennis match that is the conversation throughout the scene that will feel authentic, because authenticity is what we're chasing, not too much acting and forcing things. So Lewis first says, listen, see what I did there? That little section? So we get a sense from him right away, him or her. That's what I like about the scene, is it's kind of gender neutral. Is that this character is bigging themselves up a little bit already about their music. And so Frankie comments and says, I found it thick but accessible. And then Lewis comes back in, layered Frankie, not thick, layered. So he's correcting her right away. So we're already getting a sense about this relationship dynamic. And she doesn't really, or he doesn't, Frankie doesn't really respond to what was said, which was a little condescending from Lewis to say that Lewis was correcting them. Frankie goes on to say, I'm really happy for you. So there's a lot of different ways to play that line, isn't there, as well? It can be condescending, it can be, sort of pseudo comforting or pseudo supportive. So there's a lot of ways to play that line as well. Lewis goes on to say, thanks. I've had some emails and calls about jobs. Bobby Doyle at Island Records in London rang. Frankie says, maybe we should go to London for a while. So all I'm doing here is I'm reading through it bit by bit and getting a sense line by line what the character's emotional state is, and the tennis match that's happening. So if we fast forward to a moment down the bottom of page 1 here, Frankie jumps in after the conversation about London and says, I tried to paint today. Nothing. Sometimes I hate it. I don't miss it when I don't do it. So it's almost like Frankie is trying to interject with their personal experience about their creative journey, because for the most part of the scene it's been all about Lewis. Lewis has been, we're listening to their music, they're, quite condescending and egocentric about the music in terms of using the correct language, and their confidence is really high. Their ego is puffed up this whole time around this whole situation about what's going on surrounding this album. And so Frankie almost does, what about me as well type attitude of going, I tried to paint today, nothing. So trying to pull a bit of focus towards them. And so Lewis's brilliant advice is, do you think you're a painter? So there's a lot of ways to say that as well, but just keep in mind whether you're playing Frankie or Lewis. And at the moment in this first read, we are going through just to see both points of view, the conversation as a whole. Frankie is kind of really, if we're talking about the higher and lower status of this situation here, Frankie is definitely lower status than Lewis. Lewis is kind of, things are going well in Lewis's life. And so whether you're reading for Frankie or Lewis, that's the way you you interpret that, and that's kind of the emotional tone, the emotional temperature that you jump into, is that this is Lewis's show, right? So if I'm playing Lewis, I'm really quite comfortable in this space. We're talking about my album. And then I see this moment here from Frankie where they're feeling a bit sort of down about their creativity. And so that's an opportunity for me as Lewis to say, well, do you think you're a painter? You know, let's work through this together with my creative genius, is kind of what Lewis is going for there. And then that's a really hurtful thing to say. Obviously, Frankie responds with what? And he says, I mean, I know you're a painter, you're great, that's obvious, but it always seems like you're trying to use it as therapy. Frankie responds with cheaper than heroin. So this, as it goes on, obviously becomes this big argument. And it's really kind of an attack of their egos. Frankie was being earnest and open and vulnerable enough to share their position on where they were. So it's this power dynamic between that. So what I would ask, whether you're reading for Lewis or Frankie, step one, go through the whole script. Read both lines, have a think about each line, and then once you know which character you're going to play, start to focus on the W of who you're talking to. So keeping that in mind, that if you're playing Lewis, you're riding on cloud nine and you're going to direct your lines kind of from a bit of an egocentric place. And then as Frankie, because this is kind of Lewis's show, it's almost like you want to be heard as well, which is why you bring up this whole thing about, well, what about painting for me? And, you know, that whole situation here. So always just refer back to the script because it's all there, and do have a think about the relationship dynamic. If you're playing Lewis, if you have a partner dynamic that is similar to this, that's good. That's great. Hang on to that, because that's going to be super helpful. You just have to be courageous enough to allow that to happen naturally in the frame. If you're finding that maybe there's someone else in your life that this relationship dynamic is similar to, feel free to draw from that experience a little bit. So being in the position of when you're feeling great, we all have different relationship dynamics, don't we? With all these different people in our lives, whether they're our family members, our siblings, our social structures at colleagues, work, and you know, socializing with friends. So try and think about the person that you feel like you're always giving the sage-like advice to, because that's kind of what he's doing here. And it's even more personal because you're in a relationship. And then if you're playing Frankie, we've all had that experience when life isn't going so well and we have someone else who is a little bit higher status than us, and they're kind of, you know, condescending to us or pitching things to us that we're sort of just feeling a bit, you know, in a vulnerable state, and they're not really helping. So that's why when it comes down to here, when Frankie responds with cheaper than heroin, Frankie's saying that because that's a wound that cuts quite deep. And that's why Lewis responds with, don't get pissed off, I'm just trying to tell you something. So there lies in the key issues, and that's why it gets really personal towards the end of the scene here. So what I'd like you to do is read this as many times as possible and start to learn the lines so that you get it off by heart. If you do pick a character, yes, focus more on your lines, but I do really hope that you just get used to reading the whole conversation as a flow. And in a separate video, not this one, in a separate video, I will go through memorization techniques to help drop it in. But for now, I'd like you to just do your best to learn that character's lines and the overall conversation of the entire scene. And then to employ the W of who you're talking to, if I'm playing Frankie, I'm not going to be feeling great about what Lewis is saying. So what does that do to your body language? You know, you can express how you're really feeling with your body language when you're being condescended to. It's not nice. It's like, you know, maybe if you've got a drink in your hand, it's sort of something that maybe you're over fixated in your drink because you can't really look at them, and you occasionally sort of join in there. Yeah, I'm really happy for you. So different things. You can distract yourselves with something else that you're doing, and then give yourself those moments when it gets personal to then sort of turn and confront them a little bit when it's time to say, hey, it's cheaper than heroin, and start to, once that conversation kicks into gear. Similarly with Lewis, coming from a different place, being very high status and condescending, This is your show. Feel free to own this space. And every time you're talking to Frankie, you've got something to share that is just a brilliant piece of wisdom. All right? You can play with proximity here. You can walk into the frame a little bit and then go, okay, all right. You know, hey, do you think I've got some great advice for you? So feel free to play that way. You're owning your space that way. So pick the character that you're going to play. Focus on the body language and how that feels in an emotional state. Do your best to sort of tap into the book of life of what this relationship dynamic is like. Depending on the character that you're playing, you're either playing high status or low status. And also, just to tailor things off a little bit, just to tie things off a little bit here, a couple of rules of thumb. You'll notice I'm in here as in what is known as a mid-shot, okay? So you can set the camera to a mid-shot, just above sort of the sternum line here. And also with the eye line, you want to have the eye line of the reader or the person you're acting the scene with, or some sort of a visual cue, which is what we refer to as an eye line, just as close to the lens as possible. So just offside here. So you might want to set something up that can be, if you don't have a reader due to certain restrictions at the moment, you can just pop up like a lamp or something like that, or just, any sort of prop, or even if you just want to put them down in a chair like that and you can just look at the chair. And this is the experience you're speaking from. But try to have your eye line as close to the lens as possible. That way we get to see the whites of your eyes, and we really get invited into sort of what's happening here within the scene. We like to see the whites of the eyes are the windows to the soul, so that's a little key point in terms of just technicalities. Feel free to write any questions in the comments section or send them directly to me. Really, what this is about is exploring the relationship of who you're talking to, how these lines make you feel. So I hope you enjoy this exercise, and I look forward to the next lesson.